Go to this computer. All right, so welcome to our Zoom study for the last Sunday of the church year, right? We start Advent next Sunday, last Sunday of the church year. I have no idea how we're going to tie the second or the middle third of Matthew 13 into the end of the church year, but we'll even try. No. So where we left off the parable. We did the parable of the sower last week. We are working our way through the parables of Jesus, and we're going to pick up where we left off in Matthew chapter 13, verse 24. I'm going to get a screen share going on here so we can see that, and we will jump right into the text because we have, not surprisingly, a lot of ground to cover tonight. Let's go to this. Move this over here. That's fine. Ooh, no, not like that. No. Oh, yeah. There you go. Got to get all your faces over here. All right. With that, we are ready to go. Parable of the weeds, and so much more. We have a lot to get to tonight, so here we go. Matthew chapter 13, 24 to 30. We're gonna take Jesus all at once. He put another parable before them, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field." So just like the parable of the sower, this one again is about a man sowing seed in a field. But as you'll see, this parable's markedly different. But while his men were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared also. And the servants of the master of the house came to him and said to him, "Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have weeds?" He said to them, "An enemy has done this." So the servants said to him, "Then do you want us to go and gather them?" But he said, "No, lest in gathering the weeds you root up the wheat along with them. Let both grow together until the harvest, and at harvest time I will tell the reapers, gather the weeds first and bind them into bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn." All right. So far the text. And again, we looked last week at how does Jesus interpret the parables, because the parable of the sower is the one that Jesus gives an explanation to. And so we want to interpret parables, at least in the Gospel of Matthew, the way that Jesus has already interpreted one of his parables in the Gospel of Matthew. And the way Jesus has interpreted his parable is a conservative allegory, let's say, where things in the parables stand for or represent something else. And so we have a number of items in the parable that we need to figure out what they mean, what they represent. The first thing is you have people, right? You have a man who sowed seed, also known as the master of the house. You have an enemy. Nancy said. You also have an enemy. Housekeeping, Zoom housekeeping. There we go. You have an enemy, the one who came and sowed weeds, and he's called an enemy twice, so we know that's who he is. And then you have the other people in the parable are the servants of the house, right? So they all potentially need interpret or signify or stand for something else. Then there are the things in the parable, and there are the good seed, the weeds, and the harvest are the things in the parable. And then there are actions that are taken in the parable. There's more than this. There's the sowing, there's the enemy coming, but as I think relates to the meaning of the parable, as you'll see, the important actions are the gathering and the binding and the burning. And you could argue that leaving the weeds and the wheat alone, the action of doing nothing, is also an important action, specifically in the lives of the intended reader of the Gospel of Matthew. However, when it comes to actually interpreting this parable, we are going to have to wait. Why? Because Jesus made his disciples wait. he doesn't give an interpretation of the parable right away. Instead, he moves on from this parable to the next parable. He put another parable before them, saying, the kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard seed. Again, we're dealing with this seed parables. Is like a grain of mustard seed that a man took and sowed in his field. It is the smallest of all seeds, but when it has grown, it is larger than all the garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches. So finally, we come to a very important aspect of parables. They need not be long. We've had the parable of the sower is reasonably long. The parable of the weeds is reasonably long. There are parables that are longer than both, but there are also parables that are short, 1 or 2 verses long. All right. But just because it's a short parable doesn't mean it's an easy parable. And I would argue that this parable and the one that comes next are difficult. So I think the first thing we need to understand when we come to this parable, and by the way, I'm asking you to interpret at the bottom. I'm not going to do this one. This one's hard. What are we paying you for? No. It's important to know what the kingdom of heaven is, right? The kingdom of heaven is a phrase that is used frequently in the Gospel of Matthew. And by the time we get to chapter 13, the intended reader would know that the kingdom of heaven is anywhere where God is breaking into the world and making right what sin has made wrong. So the kingdom of heaven is not a static territory. It's not when we think of kingdoms, usually it's, well, the kingdom is a territory that is under the rule of a king, but it's the static territory that is the kingdom. When it comes to the kingdom of heaven, or if you like Greek, the basileia to Uranos, it is not a static, inactive piece of property, but rather it is the act of reigning. It is the act of heaven reigning. It's an action, right? So, for example, the kingdom of heaven is where the blind are given their sight. The kingdom of heaven is where Jesus makes the deaf hear. It's where the dead are raised. It's where sins are forgiven. It is where demons are cast out. It is where the truth is proclaimed. It is where the good news is preached. It is anywhere where God is breaking into the world and making the world look more like heaven, right? So we already know that that's what the kingdom of heaven is. And not a big surprise to us, but it was a big surprise to them back then, that the kingdom of heaven is it's where Jesus is doing his thing. Jesus is the one that is inaugurating the kingdom of heaven on earth, which ultimately he will give his disciples, the apostles, the 12, or the 11 actually on the mountain, the authority to carry on this kingdom of heaven work in his name after he has ascended. And it is the work that has been given to his church today through the proclamation of the gospel, the sacraments, and also anywhere where where the curse is undone. So that is going on today, all foreshadowing the great coming of the kingdom of heaven at the end of the age, which this parable actually foreshadows. So the parable of the mustard seed begins by focusing on how small the thing is and ends with focusing on how big the thing is, right? So that is the parable, that the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, which starts small and ends up really, really big. But what do you make of this, which he could have just said? I mean, if you look back at the parable, it is the smallest of all seeds, but when it has grown, it is larger than all the garden plants and become a tree, period. Why not stop there? Why do I care about birds making a nest in the kingdom of heaven mustard seed tree? Right? Why is that interesting? I think, and again, we're going to leave it up to you to interpret. But I think one of the reasons why that could be included there is these parables all have things in common. They're all seed-based parables, right? The parable of the sower. The sower goes out to sow seed. Parable of the weeds. Guy sows seed and then weeds get put on top of it, right? So here's another seed parable. And another way that Jesus is connecting this parable to the one that came before it, the parable of the sower, is the sower, some of the seed gets sown on the path. And the birds come and they take it away. And now the birds are coming and making their home in the branches of the tree that the seed has grown into. So do you need to find meaning there? I'm sure if you really wanted to do, an AP level or, a PhD level parable interpretation, you could. But I think at the very least, we can say that the inclusion of the birds here connects this parable to one that came before it. So that is a little bit of teaching on the parable. Now it is your turn to offer an interpretation. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed. It starts small and ends big. How would you interpret this parable beyond that?
With the birds, isn't it pretty much like with the sower, where the birds are considered evil or the devil?
They're definitely not doing the work that the sower wants them to, right? In the parable of the sower, yeah, they're doing the devil's work, yeah. But here, so that's when the kingdom of heaven is in seed form. Can the birds overpower it?
No.
They can come and scatter it, right? They can come and snatch it up off the path. But when the kingdom of heaven is fully manifest, can the birds do anything against it? Are they blessed by it when it's fully formed? Yeah, it's their home. It's where they live. It's where they belong. So in the end, I mean, you could say, Ken, if you really want to do the PhD level interpretation of the parable, right, that in the end, the ability of yeah, it is the evil one. The ability of the evil one to do harm to the kingdom of heaven has been, he's unable to fight against it. Now, is this hinting that in the end, the evil one is converted and makes his home among, I don't think we can go that far, but he is powerless to consume or prevent the seed from taking root like he did when it was a seed, because now it's a tree. It's bigger and more powerful than he is. So yeah, good catch.
In this case, because it's now a tree, yeah, Satan can't do anything. Fine as the seeds, but perhaps once it's a tree, yeah, he is powerless.
So when, again, we're in this allegorical interpretation, when is the kingdom of heaven a seed and when is it a tree? And can it be a seed at more than one point or a tree at more than one point?
Kingdom of heaven are the people who are in the kingdom of heaven. So for example, Sermon on the Mount is a few chapters before this.
Mhm.
And he's talking about the poor and the meek are the ones who get elevated. So the very smallest of humans becomes glorified in heaven, becomes very large. So would the, is it the people of the kingdom of heaven? I don't know.
Yeah, and can you make it identical, the parable um, of the sower and the parable of, and in this parable, are they identical, or where are they different? Fred, you want to weigh in?
Think, trying to change direction. Think about the dirt. We're the dirt. We don't do anything except receive the seed. We're not responsible for turning it into a tree. It's beyond our control. So I think part of this, and birds are ubiquitous. They're like the wind. They're neither good nor bad, but there's the force of nature that carries out other intent. So in the parable of the mustard seed, the dirt had nothing to do but except lay there and accept it. And then it was given to the dirt, the seed, which became the tiny little part of what was extracted from the dirt to become this magnificent tree. So I think that's part of this side that we need to look at. It's not, obviously I think the seed is in some way the scattering or the presentation of God's word, God's will. Yeah. But it's the receiving it is nothing. There's nothing the dirt can do to make it, to ask for it or to do anything other than just lay there and accept it.
Mm-hmm. Is the kingdom of heaven limited to, because Fred, you're talking about conversion and justification and sanctification. Is, if I'm hearing you correctly.
I don't know. I'd go that far. It's to say, like, God's blessings are something just that we receive, nothing we can earn. Mm-hmm. Nothing we can do anything to. It's not the dirt that's crying out, here I'm waiting for the seed. It's just given and you accept it.
I'm going to go probably a completely different way. I'm going to focus on the starting and ending size of the mustard seed. If you look at other things that God has created, it's really the small things. If you take, for example, the atom, how small that is, you can't even see it. And yet, if you split that atom, it can be a nuclear bomb, yeah. And so I'm looking at a lot of things that are very small and insignificant. God is looking at those things as very important. So I'm going completely different than the direction that Fred has gone, but this is good because it's really made me think.
Larry, you just joined us. You want to weigh in?
You have to say what the question is again, because we just got here.
Welcome.
Yeah, I was late from the Bible study at church.
Are you still rooting for the Browns?
I never have rooted for the Browns.
Bengals?
Yes. But they're a losing team, so it doesn't matter.
No, we're just talking about interpreting this parable, because this is one that Jesus does not give us an interpretation to, and so we are trying to interpret it on our own. And I weighed in at the beginning saying I think this is one of the more, this Matthew 13, 31 to 32 is one of the more difficult parables of Jesus to interpret, because it's easy to stop at it is larger than all the garden plants and becomes a tree. It'd be nice if it ended there, because then you could say the interpretation that works is the kingdom of heaven, starts small and ends big. It started small and unnoticed in the person and work of Jesus. And now 30 years later, when Matthew's gospel is being written, you have worshiping, believing communities, followers of Jesus, beginning to be scattered all over the Roman Empire. And so you can see in the life of the early church how they would have interpreted this parable to be, oh yeah, this is about the growth of the church, about believers in Jesus. And Jesus was the seed unless a kernel of wheat dies and is planted in the earth, um, unless he dies and rises, you can't have any growth. But then, which is a neat interpretation, but then it says at the end, so the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches. And you can say, well, yeah, but we don't want to include that in our interpretation because who are the birds and all this? And Ken brought up a good point, that the birds in the previous parable are doing the work of the evil one, and there they are. So
I don't know. I don't know what to think.
I mean, if you're willing to enlarge and Fred, what you're saying about birds being ubiquitous back then, if birds are representative in the parable of the sower of the evil one, to allow a little more latitude with what they are interpreted as here, could it be that the birds are representative sort of what they were in the first parable, but of generally that which is opposed to Christ and his kingdom, to the kingdom of heaven, and maybe people, such that even the non-believers, the enemies of Jesus, are blessed by the work that Jesus did and that now is being done through those believing communities who are following him. I don't know.
And maybe I was just looking at a note I have. Maybe it's referring to the fact that the heaven is going to grow to include much more, like the Gentiles and not just the Jews.
And I think how you get there is to link birds with the evil one, which the birds represent in the parable of the sower, but broaden it out a little bit to say not just the evil one, right? Not just Satan, but anything that stands opposed to Christ is not only Christ overpowering them at this point, but Christ is a blessing to them. And so the early Christians should recognize, the tree doesn't like, the mustard seed tree doesn't like swat at birds as they fly by to knock them out of the sky because they're bad. But the tree allows the birds to nest in it. And so this is a love your enemies, not the main point of the parable, but it's like a sidebar is the reason why the birds are included is kind of a love your enemies. Provide home for them, show them hospitality. Maybe. And maybe not. And maybe we're heretics. Who knows? No. That would not be heresy, by the way. You don't lose your salvation if you believe that. Good. Well, let's plow on. Here's an even shorter one. He told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven that a woman took and hid in 3 measures of flour till it was all leavened. So again, kingdom of heaven is where God's breaking into the world and makes right what sin has made wrong. Jesus teaches elsewhere a little leaven can leaven the whole lump or the whole dough, and you can't unleaven dough. You can't put leaven in and do this and then go, oh, I want to take the leaven out. And there you are, like Ron talking about like atoms and molecules and stuff. There you are pulling out all the once it's in, it's in. And so, but the question is, given the not a lot of seeds here. I mean, we can talk about wheat, right? The end product, of flour or wheat is flour, can be. What do you make of this parable? What is a possible teaching of Jesus to come out of this?
Well, no, the commentary says the leaven symbolizes evil.
The commentary says that?
It
I would
does.
think it's opposite.
I read that too. It was saying that in other contexts, the yeast is evil, but in this context that Jesus is using it, it can't be.
Oh, but here, Jesus pictured it as a transforming agent that works quietly and almost unnoticed. I didn't see the but. Sorry.
Yeah, Fred.
I've had 3 people that I'm aware of in the last couple of weeks go into hospice, and one passed away, and well, 2 passed away, and one is on her way out. And what really, whenever this happens, somebody I've known for many years, I kind of think about what their life has been like. Now, when you look at the flower is temporal. The flower is just empty and really not worth much. Leaven is generational. You don't just come up with leaven. Leaven has a long past. If you go to some place in San Francisco, they've been using the same starter for sourdough for 150 years. It just keeps going on and on. So when the leaven comes into your life, it's an eternal force that comes and changes the bread, or changes the dead flour into a living thing to become bread. That's what leaven is. It's kind of it's an eternal force that comes through us. It's the faith going back 2,000 years that's passed on until it hits one of us, and we become living like the dead wheat becomes living to become bread.
I like that death to life, Fred. I think what agrees with you is the amount of flour the woman has. There's no reason why she needs that much flour. That's an awful lot of flour. I forget in the commentary I read how much 3 measures is, but it's like
50 pounds, I think.
Yeah, she doesn't need that much. But you're talking about how that generational leaven can influence lots of dead people, lots of dead things, and make them alive. I like that.
This one says 84 cups.
How many cups do you need to make a loaf of bread?
5.
5 cups per loaf?
That's 16 loaves.
5 to 8. Depends on how many loaves you make.
So she doesn't need that much. Unless she's going to do all the baking, and all you kids are getting loaves of bread this year. That's what you get. Okay. No, I like that a lot, Fred. That's good. And the hiding, what do you make of that? It's not, she didn't do this intentionally. She hid it. And who's the woman? Or does the woman need an identity, or is it the focus on the action and the result?
Maybe the woman is Mary, and she had to hide Jesus after he was born.
A woman took and hid. And where you would find support for that, Ken, is what happens. So this is chapter 13. And chapter 13 is a continuation of what happens at the end of 12, because chapter 13 begins with that same day, and then Jesus does parables. What happens at the end of chapter 12? Who's there? In verse 46,
His mother.
Bingo. So Ken, the context says you might be winner, winner, chicken dinner. No, Mary is in, if you're reading this straight through, you were just reminded about Mary, right? So there could be a identity of Jesus thing happening here. Jesus is the living thing that belongs to the woman that gets put into the middle of all these dead things, and he makes them alive. And that is the work of Christ in the world. Yeah.
That's interesting.
Don't worry, if you say something heretical, there's only a couple people I know that watch this video after it's done. And, the odds of them getting this far into the video are pretty small, so you're safe.
Maybe makes me think of maybe Revelation, the holy city, New Jerusalem, prepared as a bride. So New Jerusalem, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband.
I was leaning towards the church or believers. But
And I'm leaning towards faith. If you had faith of a mustard seed, a mustard seed is faith and it grows because faith grows if it's nurtured.
Faith is I think faith is one of the results of the flour that's been leavened. But Adam, were you the one saying that you think it's the church, right?
well, that the woman represents the church, spreading the word through the world.
And making dead things alive. I like that, dead things alive. And there's way too much in the world, right? There's way too much flour. So the work is, it's not going to work. There's too much flour. How are we going to? We'll just give it time and watch and see what happens, and it works. I like that a lot. Cool. We could spend the rest of our time doing this, but let's move on. All right. So there's some. This is the interpretation taken out of one of the commentaries I was using. Which one I used? I used Word or New. I think I used the Word Biblical Commentary for this. I wanted a scholarly interpretation. So this is kind of what they have to say. What started small and almost unnoticeable has a large and unavoidable outcome. The exaggeration is the transformation of the seed to the tree and the flour by the leaven. Pretty much in line with what everyone's saying here, only I think you've added a lot more depth and richness and color in the various interpretations you've given as a class than what the commentary did. So bravo. Have you considered going into the SMP program? Actually, no, some exciting news. Over at the Gate, one of their members, Rob Clifton, met with me a couple times over the last month and one time last week, and he is interested in doing SMP work, which would, in 2 years, allow the Gate to call him to be their pastor, and he could do it part-time. So it would be affordable. So that's very exciting for the Gate and their potential. Potentially, we'll see what God has in store, but potentially addressing their need for a pastor. So that's exciting. Okay. Now, all these things, now we take a break. Matthew's going to let us push back from the table a little bit and go, whew, that was a lot of parables. All these things Jesus said to the crowd in parables. Indeed, he said nothing to them without a parable. This was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet. I will open my mouth in parables. I will utter what has been hidden since the foundation of the world. And you say, Pastor, this is a Bible study on parables, and this isn't a parable. Why are we studying it? Because it's the Bible. No, and it helps us understand more of the what's the purpose of parables, why does Jesus do this, just a general understanding about the parables as a whole. And it'd be awkward to skip verses 34 and 35 and jump down to 36. So we know this is the reason why he spoke in parables, to teach the disciples, not just the 12, but for those to whom it had been given to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, is his own words, and to fulfill what was spoken through Isaiah concerning those who see but do not see and hear but do not hear. So he's already spoken about the purpose of parables back in beginning in verse 10, going verse 10 through verse 17, which we looked at last week. So this is building on that theme. So not only did Isaiah prophesy about people hearing but not hearing and seeing but not seeing, in other words, so why do you speak in parables? Well, so to explain it to you guys who get it, but then to keep those who don't get it from getting it, more or less. And then you can get into some nice double predestination stuff there, and we won't do that. But this is building off of that. But the Psalms also foretold one who would speak in parables to reveal that which had been hidden forever. So Psalm 78, verses 1 through 4, which is a maskil of Asaph, says, "Give ear, O my people, to my teaching. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings from of old. And for some reason, spell check doesn't like of there, but spell check is wrong. Do you see the red dots on the page there? Yeah, you do see everything. Okay, it's a masculine. Spell check is wrong. Things that we have heard and known that our fathers have told us, we will not hide them from our children. And this is where I think it's key. If you keep reading this context from Psalms, but tell to the coming generation the glorious deeds of the Lord and his might and the wonders that he has done. And so maybe unlocking interpretation of the parables here, parables are, unless directed otherwise by their immediate context, parables about the Lord, his might, and the wonders that he has done. Parables are theocentric. They're God-centered. They're about God unless specifically instructed otherwise. So that again is why he's doing this, why he's speaking in parables. Then he left the crowds and went into the house. So if he's speaking these things to the crowds to confuse them, and now he's with the disciples, now he is going to teach them and explain the parable to them. His disciples came to him. Now, in the Gospel of Matthew, when the disciples come to Jesus, they have a lot of come to Jesus moments in the Gospel of Matthew. And this is unique to Matthew. When the disciples come to Jesus, Matthew is tipping you off to what they say next is usually going to reflect their ignorance and kind of be a silly thing for them to say, but they don't know it's silly when they're saying it, right? I wish I could think of some examples offhand here. Oh, I guess there's one place where the disciples come to Jesus and ask him, who's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Right? Like, you're speaking to him, right? You should know this by now. And so you want to know, the one place we'll go is Matthew 24 to show when the disciples come to Jesus, what comes next is silly, right? So in chapter 24, Jesus has just got done speaking chapter 23. And chapter 23 is the woe to you, Jerusalem, woe to you, woe to you, woe to you, woe to you. It's Jesus laying out condemnation against Israel. We don't have time to get the eschatological thing. Jerusalem is bad. They've done a lot of bad things. They are ripe for judgment and destruction, right? So then chapter 24 begins. Jesus left the temple and was going away. He's just pronounced judgment on the whole city. When his disciples came, they're coming to Jesus to point out to him the building of the temple. So they're like, he just got done saying, I'm going to destroy this thing. This thing is sinful. This is wicked. And the disciples come to him and go, do you see how nice and shiny the temple is? Like, and he said to them, he said, you see these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone on another that will not be thrown down. So you see that cute temple, the nice shiny, I'm going to destroy that temple, right? Then in the next segment, he sat on the Mount of Olives. The disciples came to him privately, saying, tell us, when will these things be and what will be the sign of your coming in the end of the age? And what's silly about that is that the disciples think that the coming of Jesus will be to come to destroy Jerusalem, and that the destruction of Jerusalem is the end of the age. And that's silly because the destruction of Jerusalem is not, in fact, the end of the age. And that's why what they say there is silly. So if you go back, that's just one or two examples. If you go back to chapter 13, so now we're back in the parables, the disciples come to Jesus. Explain to us the parable of the weeds in the field. In other words, they're admitting we don't get this. Okay, so here he goes. He answered, the one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. That's Jesus. The field is the world, and the good seed is the sons of the kingdom. The weeds are the sons of the evil one, and the enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are angels. Okay. So there are limits. At this point, you have to throw out that there are limits to what a parable is, the scope of the parable. This is not a double predestination parable. Like you can get into, you can't help if you're a kernel of wheat or a weed, God foreordained you to be one or the other. And so you're one or the other, and there's nothing you can do to change who you are. So, and then you get double predestination. That's not the point of the parable. We're gonna find out, and again, the text will teach us what the point of the parable is. And it's a very specific point that he's getting at here, and it's one that was, you can show from other New Testament writings, very important to the early church. But rather, so that's not the point of the parable. The point of the parable is to explain why the righteous are living with the unrighteous, right? Why are wheat and weeds growing together? Why are the righteous and the unrighteous allowed to live in God's good earth? Why doesn't God get rid of the weeds? Right? This was the same question that Peter addresses in 2 Peter chapter 3, where the scoffers will come and they will say, where is the promise of his coming? Why hasn't Jesus come back yet? For ever since the fathers fell asleep, all things are continuing as they were from the beginning of creation. Why are the weeds and the wheat still together? Right? This is what in Matthew's gospel, Jesus talks more about the end of the age in chapters 24 and specifically in 25, with parables of the virgins, the talents, and not the parable, but the extended metaphor of the sheep and the goats. Yes, Fred.
The only troubling part of this parable is you can't convert a weed into a wheat.
And that's where I would say the limit of the parable is, that that's not the focus. The focus is on why are they growing? Why isn't the owner doing something? There's weeds growing with, why isn't the world being judged? I mean, and of course your Calvinist friends would say, no, that's exactly the point of the parable, that there are weeds, there is wheat, and we need to separate them, and there's nothing they would take a different approach. But I think you can show from the text itself that the focus isn't on weeds can't become wheat and wheat can't become weeds. It has to do with why are they being allowed to grow together. Also, what's interesting, Fred, and maybe this pushes back on the double predestination even more from the text. The sons here, the sons of the evil one and the sons of the kingdom, we think because it's using a gender specific, sons of, that it has to be people, but it doesn't necessarily need to be people. And I think the text argues that the sons here are not only people, but has to do with, it's bigger than that, right? That they are either creations of the Son of Man or creations of the evil one. And Jesus will explain that in the following verses. So I think we're dealing more, not just with people, but with the entire creation. And this is why. Just as the weeds are gathered and burned with the fire, so will it be at the end of the age. Okay. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all causes of sin and all lawbreakers and throw them into the fiery furnace. So if the weeds are the sons of the evil one, which are going to be thrown into the fiery furnace, then the weeds are not just lawbreakers, but all causes of sin. So now we've broadened the scope from just people to anything that stands opposed to the will of God. So sin, the effects of sin, the potential for sin, all the bad stuff is gone. Right? Does that make sense? So let's dig a little deeper. So there are similarities between this parable and the preaching of John the Baptist. And the intended reader of the gospel would have this insight into Jesus' teaching already, where John comes and he proclaims, I baptize you with water for repentance, but he who is coming after me is mightier than I, whose sandals I am not worthy to carry. He will baptize you with the Holy Spirit and with fire. His winnowing fork is in his hand, and he will clear his threshing floor, gathering his wheat into the barn. But the chaff, or in this parable, the weeds, he will burn with unquenchable fire. So there is this already with Jesus. You've been told he is the one that is going to separate and judge the world. Right? And you see that again in the parables in Matthew chapter 25. Does that make sense? fiery furnace, you may be able to do some Daniel stuff there, but probably not. But the idea of not just bad people are going to be gone after the judgment, right? But it's all, and by bad people, I mean people outside of Christ, but also all bad things. And so that raises the question, what is that going to be like for us to live in a world without sin, the effects of sin, or the potential for sin? How different will this world look like when all the weeds are taken away and burned? Right? No more decaf coffee, things like that. So just as the weeds are gathered and burned with fire, so will it be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all causes of sin and all lawbreakers and throw them into the fiery furnace. So again, in the end, we are not raptured to some other place or dimension. Rather, the kingdom of the Son of Man will remove all sin, the effects of sin, the potential for sin from this creation. Again, not just sinners, but all causes of sin. So Jesus has moved from explaining why God is allowing for the righteous and unrighteous to live together for such a long time to teaching what it will be like in the parousia, or the final judgment, the end of the age, when the weeds and the wheat are finally and irreversibly separated. All right. And I mean, it's wonderful to think about, what is that going to be like? Right. So one of the causes of sin, the aging process, for example, is not part of God's original design for creation. The aging process is the result of sin being in the world. So what's it going to look like without aging? What's it going to look like to be in a world where you can't get hurt? To be in a world where there is no dangerous weather or natural disasters, which are unnatural and are products of a fallen world, causes of sin. What's that going to be like? Well, as you think about that, let me put you to sleep with some Greek as we wrap up for the day. So some fun with Greek. Here he talks about his messengers coming, right? His angels, right? And the word there is tous angelus, angels, literally meaning messengers. The Son of Man will send his angeluses, his messengers. However, I wonder if there isn't a connection here to the ton de dodeca apostolon, the 12 apostles. And apostles means not necessarily messengers, but pretty darn close, sent ones. And they are sent, the apostles are sent, not with, they're sent with a message, right, about Jesus. So the idea of the Son of Man will send his angels, necessarily being chubby kids with wings playing harps, right? That kind of angels, which we already talked about. Angels are not chubby kids with wings playing harps, but spiritual beings. Is that what he means by he will send his angels? Possibly. But keep in mind 1 Corinthians chapter 6. Who are these angels that the Son of Man is sending? Who is it that removes the weeds, or is involved in the removal of the weeds from the field? Keep in mind 1 Corinthians 6:2. Paul's writing to the Christians in Corinth, of course. Do you not know that the saints will judge the world? And if the world is to be judged by you, are you incompetent to try trivial cases? I think there is at least a chance that the angels, the angeluses, the messengers that are sent by the Son of Man to divide the weeds and the wheat, possibly could be people like you and me, that somehow we will be involved in that aspect of the final judgment. And maybe not, but I think there's at least a chance based on cross-referencing 1 Corinthians 6 with this. Maybe. Let's move on to this word for causes of sin, right? I think it's an interesting phrase. So I looked it up in the Greek, and it is ta scandala, right? Scandalon, scandalous, right? causes of sin, but that word scandala literally means a trap or a stumbling block. He will remove all stumbling blocks and lawbreakers. What's interesting about this is that Jesus applied this very phrase to himself. According to GreekBible.com, scandala can be his person and career were so contrary to the expectations of Jews concerning the Messiah that they rejected him. So in one sense, a scandala can be interpreted as causes of sin. In another place, Jesus says, I'm a stumbling block, to so many. But I think a good definition here on this word, ta scandala, meaning causes of sin, interpreted as causes of sin, is any person or thing by which one is entrapped or drawn into error or sin. So maybe no social media in the resurrection, right, in the final judgment. No slow cars, right? Because they pull out in front of you and then you get angry. And so just be fast cars, just be Hellcats. They have to rename them, but you get the idea. Okay. And then the other phrase there for lawbreakers is poiantos tein anomion. Lawbreakers, literally ones who are doing unlawfulness or sin, practitioners or doers of sin, right? So it's not talking about people who have a criminal record. When it talks about lawbreakers, it's talking about ones who persist in unrepentant habitual sin. So people who are under the control and influence of sin, not people who are under the control and influence of God. We got 2 minutes here before we wrap up because we got to jump over and do the confirmation Zoom thing next. Then Jesus has this wonderful phrase at the end, in that place, the place where the weeds go to be burned, there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears, let him hear. And again, spell check doesn't like hear there, and spell check is wrong. This would seem to be Jesus' favorite description of the final fate of the poiantos tein anomion, the workers of lawlessness. And weeping and gnashing of teeth to me is a way to say both eternal anger as well as eternal sadness. And so if that's the state of the one, then the condition of the other must be the opposite. Right? So whatever's the opposite of angry and sad, right? Shine. Again, there's this metaphor of the gospel for light and darkness, not just for the gospel of John, but here it is poking its head into the gospel of Matthew. Back to the original parable. We got 2 minutes to solve the riddle of the original parable, the parable of the weeds and the wheat. We haven't talked about this yet. In parables, usually the meaning is found wherever there is an exaggeration, right? Is where the intended focus of the parable is. So where's the exaggeration in the wheat and the weeds? Well, the plan of the enemy, I think, the plan of the enemy to sow weeds among the wheat. Who does that? Right? That's a weird thing. First of all, I had this collection of weed seeds, right? And then instead of being productive on my own farmland, I'm going to sow weeds among your wheat. It's just a weird thing to do. Right? And again, this parable doesn't make you think that they're in competition with each other, right? Where if I put weeds in your field, then you're not going to get a crop and I'm going to sell all my stuff. The guy sowing weeds, we don't know that he has wheat, right? He's just a jerk. So that's the first place that's interesting. And then, of course, or the exaggeration, just how silly and bad the evil one is, right? Just kind of and then the patience of the master, right? His servants were willing to divide wheat from weeds. They were willing to go out there and go, this, right? One over here, they were willing to do that. From a pragmatic standpoint, who cares if they uproot a little wheat with the weeds? At the end of the day, you're still getting your crop in, right? They can get rid of the weeds and spare a majority of the wheat from being choked out by the weeds. Remember the previous parable, the wheat living with the weeds, it's not good for the wheat. But God is unwilling that any should perish. And so you see here the mercy, if you will, of the master, that he's not willing to have any of his wheat be uprooted with the weeds and thrown away. He's going to wait until the the harvest time comes, and then we can divide wheat from weeds without throwing any wheat away with the weeds, because they will be very easily identifiable. One is wheat, one is weed. So at the end, you see the mercy of God in waiting until the end for the end. All right, it's 8 o'clock. I need to jump over to Zoom, but are there any questions? The other Zoom.
What parables will we talk about next Sunday?
Haha, very good question. You know what we could do? There's 3 of them that come up next. So verse 44 to 50, 7 verses there. Hidden treasure, great pearl, and parable of the net. Because there's a lot of different interpretations there. And if I have time this week with all that's coming up with the holiday and that, to really get into what the different interpretations are, especially of the pearl, right? We'll have some fun with it. Cool. All right, come join me in Confirmation Land.
Great study.
Yep, thanks, Dusty.
Thank you.
You.
Bye.
Have a good night.
Good night.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
And done.